My wife couldn't handle tonight. Please welcome Claire Whitmore.
You chose this room, Daniel. I only arrived in it.
Chapter 1. The wife he forgot was watching. She had stopped counting the small mercies of his inattention 2 years ago. Now she simply cataloged them. The way a naturalist catalogs the behavior of a species she no longer expects to change. The way Daniel Voss tied his tie. Twice from the left, then adjusted with both hands. Then checked his reflection as though the first 2 attempts had been rough drafts, and this third was the final version prepared for public consumption. The way he hummed almost inaudibly while doing it, not a song exactly, more a frequency he broadcast to fill the silence he had stopped noticing, was between them. The way he set his cufflinks on the marble bathroom ledge with a small, satisfied click, as though each one were a period at the end of a sentence he had already decided the meaning of. Claire Voss sat in the armchair by the window of suite 1408 at the Meridian, her legs folded underneath her, and watched him through the open bathroom door. She had been in this hotel for 4 days. Or he had, technically. The suite charged to the Voss Holdings corporate account for the week surrounding the Hale Group's annual charity gala and all its attending dinners, meetings, and appearances. Claire had driven up from their house in Greenwich on Monday, the way she did every year. With a garment bag and a carefully assembled set of expectations she kept deliberately low enough to survive. The garment bag was still hanging in the closet, untouched. The expectations had not survived past Monday evening, when she found the second room service receipt on the desk. Breakfast for 2, delivered to a junior suite 2 floors below. Signed with a room number that was not theirs. She had not said anything. She had set the receipt back on the desk, gone into the bathroom, run the shower until the mirror fogged completely white, and stayed in there until the hot water ran out. That was Tuesday. It was now Thursday, and Daniel was adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, and Claire was watching him from the armchair. And none of it felt like the moment when everything changed. It felt exactly like what it was, the end of something that had been ending for a very long time. Finally close enough to touch. "Are you sure you don't want to try?" Daniel said, without looking at her. He was addressing his own reflection, technically, though he aimed the question in her general direction with the casual precision of someone who has already decided what the answer will be. "The Whitfields will ask after you. Tell them I'm resting." He finally turned, appraising her with the expression she had mapped carefully over 3 years, the one that was almost concern, the one that stopped just short of actually looking at her. "You do look tired, Claire." She was 14 weeks pregnant. She had not told him. "I'll be fine," she said. He straightened his jacket, pulled once at each sleeve to even the cuffs, and picked up his phone from the bedside table. He glanced at the screen. A brief, practiced glance that told her nothing and confirmed everything, and slid it into his inside pocket. "I won't be late," he said. "You don't have to hurry on my account," she said. He kissed her forehead. She let him. The cologne was different, not his usual, something she did not recognize. Warmer and heavier, the kind of scent chosen deliberately to please a specific person. She filed it away alongside the breakfast receipt and the 4 late nights and the business trips to a city he had never mentioned having clients in. "Get some rest," Daniel said. Then he was gone, and the suite door closed behind him with the quiet, decisive sound of a room returning to its natural state. She counted to 30 slowly, evenly, the way her father had taught her to think before speaking in any room where the stakes were high. "Give every situation time to be what it actually is," he used to say, "not what you think it is in the first 10 seconds. Her father had been a man who understood the difference between a reaction and a response, and he had tried, in his patient and practical way, to teach her the same. She had not always been a good student, but she was learning, had been learning, over these past 4 days, at a speed that grief and anger and a deep, cold clarity tend to produce in people who have run out of the option to look away. At 30, she reached for the phone on the side table, not her personal cell, the hotel room line, billed to the corporate account, which created a record she would deal with later and could not worry about now. She dialed a number she had memorized 4 days ago, when Gerald Fitch had read it to her over the phone, and she had written it on the back of a grocery receipt, and then carried that receipt in her coat pocket for 2 days before she was certain she was ready to use it. It rang twice. The voice on the other end was unhurried, precise. The voice of a man who had been waiting for this call for longer than she had been ready to make it. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't. I wasn't sure I would," she said, honestly, because she owed him that. Then Marcus Hale said, with something in his voice she recognized without being able to name, a quality that belonged to people who had known her father well, a particular careful warmth. The warmth of someone who has watched a child grow up from a respectful distance and is now trying to speak to the adult without erasing the child they remember. Look exactly like your father when you've already made up your mind, and you're just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Claire was quiet for a moment. "You can't see me." "No," he agreed. "But I've been listening to the way you breathe since you said hello. And your father used to do the same thing. That very controlled, very deliberate quality to it. Right before he told someone something they weren't going to like. I assume you've seen the guest list for tomorrow evening, and you understand what I need from you in person." Gerald explained the clause. She pressed her free hand flat against her knee to stop it from trembling. Not from fear. She recognized now that it was not fear. It was something closer to grief, and something that was also very close to fury. 72 hours from the time he contacted me, or the voting rights transfer automatically to the interim board, which would give Daniel's associates, which would give the entity your husband has been negotiating with. Marcus Hale said, very carefully, a window to make a formal acquisition offer to the interim board that would effectively bypass your rights under the trust entirely. His voice remained even, not unkind. "I want to be precise with you, Claire, because I think you deserve precision right now, far more than you deserve comfort. Your husband has been operating for approximately 8 months under the assumption that you did not know the trust existed. Everything he has built in that time is constructed on that single assumption." "He's wrong," Claire said. "Yes," Marcus Hale said. She closed her eyes. Through the window of Suite 1408, the city arranged itself the way cities do at night. All light and implied distance. All surface with no visible depth. Every lit window a life she knew nothing about. She thought about her father, who had built things with patience and without apology, who had believed that the most important thing a person could leave behind was not money or property or even a name, but a structure. Something that would remain standing after the person who built it was no longer there to hold it up. He had built a structure for her. She had not known it until 4 days ago. She had not known it because she had spent 3 years avoiding questions she was afraid of hearing the answers to, and the cost of that avoidance was still being calculated. "I'll be there tomorrow," she said, not as his wife. "I know," Marcus said. "I'll make sure the room understands the distinction." She hung up. She sat in the quiet of the suite for a long time afterward, the kind of quiet that has actual texture, that presses against the skin like a held breath, and she did not cry, though there was something in her chest that wanted to. Instead, she reached for her own phone, opened her messages, scrolled up past 3 years of the domestic mundane, dinner plans, grocery lists, a photo she had sent him once of a sunset over Long Island Sound with no words attached, just the image, which he had acknowledged with a thumbs-up emoji. She kept scrolling until she found the last conversation she could identify as real. 2 winters ago, she had told him she was thinking about reaching out to her father's old colleagues, about perhaps returning to the orbit of the family company in some advisory capacity. "I don't think that's a good idea right now." Daniel had written back, within 4 minutes. "You're still grieving. You need time. She had believed him. She understood now what he had actually been doing with those 3 months. She understood a great many things now that she wished she had understood sooner, and she was making her peace with the fact that she hadn't. Not quickly, not gracefully, but with the methodical determination that comes from having no available alternative. Regret was a luxury she could afford later. Right now she had 41 hours, a 72-hour clock, and one navy dress. Claire unfolded herself from the armchair and moved to the closet. Inside was not the dress she had brought from Greenwich. She had returned that one 2 days ago, a conservative blush-pink sheath she had purchased with Daniel's tastes in mind, the kind of thing that made her look appropriate and eminently forgettable. During the 4-hour window on Tuesday afternoon, when she had slipped out and taken a cab uptown to a boutique whose owner had known her mother, what Claire unzipped from the garment bag now was midnight navy, floor length, with a structured bodice and a quality of fabric that moved the way expensive things move, not loudly, but with a kind of quiet authority that fills a room by not demanding to fill it. It had belonged to her mother originally. Claire had found it in a storage box 2 months ago and had brought it to a tailor on Lexington Avenue to have it altered and brought forward just slightly, enough that it was unmistakably hers now, while still carrying, in the weight of its fabric and the line of its cut, something of her mother's particular way of occupying a room. Her mother, who had stood in rooms full of people who believed themselves more consequential than her, and had smiled, and had been patient, and had always known exactly where the exits were and which ones she intended to use when the time came. She hung the dress on the back of the bathroom door. The baby moved. It was very small still, a flutter, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that might be dismissed as ordinary sensation by someone who did not know what they were waiting for. But Claire knew. She had been keeping very still in the early mornings and the quiet evenings, hoping for exactly this. She pressed her palm gently against her lower abdomen, and the flutter came again, brief and certain, like something making a quiet announcement to a world it hadn't seen yet. She went to the desk, opened her notebook, and reviewed what she had already written. Call Gerald. Confirm documentation transfer timing. Confirm with Marcus arrival sequence. Do not mention Gala to Daniel. Pack the envelope. She reached into the inner pocket of her overnight bag and withdrew it. Letter size, ivory, with the logo of Fitch and Caldwell Attorneys at Law embossed in the upper left corner. She had received it 3 months ago, forwarded to her personal P.O. box. An address Daniel had never been given. She had opened it once, read the first paragraph, and then carefully folded it back along its original creases and returned it to the envelope, because what she had read in that first paragraph had required time to absorb. She had spent 3 months becoming sure of what she was going to do with it. She placed the envelope on the desk, still sealed, and covered it carefully with the open notebook. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the center of the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about her father. James Whitmore had died 3 years and 4 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in November, of a cardiac event his doctor described as sudden and without warning, though Claire had always suspected this was not quite accurate. Her father had been a man who noticed everything, who felt everything deeply beneath a surface of composed and deliberate calm, and who had spent the last year of his life worrying about his daughter's marriage with the particular worry of a person who can see clearly what the person they love cannot yet bring themselves to see. He had never said it directly, but he had called her more often in that last year. He had asked questions about her work, her interests, the things she'd been reading, the way he used to ask when she was young, and he wanted to know if she was still herself. He had built a trust. He had placed 34% of Whitmore family real estate holdings into that trust, to be managed by Marcus Hale as trustee. He had embedded within the trust document a provision that Gerald Fitch described as unusually specific in its activation conditions. The provision had 2 triggers. The first, Claire's first confirmed pregnancy. The second, a direct meeting between Claire and Marcus Hale within 72 hours of the first trigger's activation. Both triggers, if met, transferred full control of the stake to Claire immediately and irrevocably, bypassing any claims, negotiations, or agreements that might have been reached in the interim. Gerald Fitch had called her 4 times in the past month. The fourth call she had answered last Monday afternoon, sitting in the garden behind the Greenwich house in the last of the autumn light. And Gerald had told her, in the measured cadence of a man who has spent his career delivering information that changes lives, that the activation had been triggered and the clock had started. At some point before dawn, she heard the suite door open, Daniel returning, quietly, carefully. The practiced quietness of someone who is not quite sneaking in. She kept her eyes closed. She heard him undress with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, in low light. Heard the bathroom door open and close. Heard the shower run for 9 minutes. Then heard him come to bed with the 6 inches of careful, married distance he had been maintaining between them for the better part of a year, which she had spent that year interpreting as stress or distraction, and understood now as something considerably more deliberate. Within 5 minutes, he was asleep. Claire lay in the dark, listening to him breathe, and thought. 40 hours. In the morning, Daniel was gone before she woke. He had left a note. Breakfast meeting. Back by noon. Don't overdo it today. She read the note and picked up the pen he had left uncapped, and capped it and set it back down. She ordered room service, opened her laptop, and pulled up the Gala's guest list, which Gerald had emailed 2 days ago. She found Daniel's name. Table 4. Assigned seat beside the Whitfields. She found the second name at table 4, listed as guest of D. Voss, and she read that notation 3 times with a carefully maintained expression, and then scrolled on. She found Marcus Hale at table 1, which was table 1 because there was no legitimate alternative for the man whose family name was on the building where this gala was held. She found her own name at table 1 as well, in a position marked reserved, added by Marcus's office at her request the day before. She ate breakfast facing the window, watching the city perform its morning reopening. She thought about her father, who had loved cities for exactly that quality, their size, their willingness to contain everything without requiring it to make sense. When she finished, she went to the desk, picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, then opened it and read it, all of it. She read it the way her father had taught her to read any document that mattered, slowly, from multiple directions, looking not only for what it said, but for what it was designed to do, who it was designed to protect. When she finished, she set the pages down in a neat stack on the hotel bedspread and placed her hand over them. Her father had known, not the specifics, but the shape of it. He spent the last months of his life building the legal architecture of a counterweight, quietly, without telling her, because telling her would have required her to accept something she was not yet ready to accept. And he had loved her too much to force that on her before she was ready to carry it. He had trusted her to get there. She texted Gerald Fitch 3 words. Ready. His reply came in 40 seconds. He'll be waiting at the north entrance. You won't be alone. She set the phone down on the bedside table. She pressed her hand against her stomach, gently, where something small and not yet known to anyone else in the world was in the process of becoming. She straightened, set her shoulders, and began to get ready. The offices of Fitch and Caldwell occupied a suite on the 12th floor of a building on Madison Avenue that had been erected in 1928 and had spent the intervening century developing the kind of institutional gravity that money alone cannot purchase, only time. Chapter 2. Everything he built on borrowed ground. The carpets were the color of old moss. The windows were tall and narrow, framing the city in vertical slices, as though the building had decided long ago how much of the outside world it was willing to admit. There were no flowers on the reception desk. There was a painting of a winter landscape Claire had been looking at since she was 7 years old, when her father had first brought her here and told her, in the lobby, while they waited for the elevator, that this was the office of the man who kept his most important secrets, and that important secrets deserved a proper address. She had not been back since the reading of the will. Gerald Fitch was waiting for her in the conference room. He was 71. He had been her father's attorney for 26 years, and his friend, she believed, for nearly as long. The particular friendship of men who have handled each other's most consequential decisions and found, in that handling, that they share a standard for what consequential decisions should look like. He had silver hair, closely kept, and the specific kind of stillness that develops in people who have learned not to fill silence with unnecessary sound. He shook her hand with the directness of a man who respects her enough to be straightforward about it. "Sit down, Claire," he said. He poured coffee without asking whether she wanted it, because he had known her long enough to know that she did, and that she would not ask, and slid the cup across the table before taking his own seat with a manila folder in front of him. He did not reach for the folder immediately. "I want to start with your father," he said. She hadn't expected that. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Because I think you need to understand something about the man before we go through the documents. James did not build what he built for himself. He built it for you. Not because he doubted your ability to build things on your own. He never doubted that for a single day. But because he understood, with a particular clarity that comes to fathers who are paying close attention, that the world doesn't simply hand intelligent women the tools they need. It hides them. And he decided, while he still had the time to do it, that he was going to make sure you knew where to look. He knew you wouldn't have accepted it the way he intended it." Gerald said, without apology or softness. "You were married. You were in the process of making a life. And he was not certain the life you were making was the right one. But he was not the kind of man to say that to your face when you hadn't asked him. So he said it in the only language he was certain would survive him. He looked at her directly. He said it in this. The documents were organized with the precision of someone who had handled them many times. He walked her through it slowly, in the order her father had intended. First, the trust structure itself, its legal architecture, the specific mechanisms by which control would pass. Then the schedule of assets, the percentage breakdown of Whitmore family real estate holdings, the current valuation, the annual distributions that had been quietly accumulating in a managed account under Marcus Hale's stewardship. Then the activation clause. She had read the first paragraph of the activation clause on Monday and the full text this morning in the hotel. But Gerald read it aloud now, in his careful, even voice, as though the precision of the reading gave it a different weight than the silence of the page. She let him read it. She had spent the 3 years since her father's death telling herself, when she thought about the trust at all, that he had been overcautious, that the provision Marcus held had been a measure of his protectiveness rather than his foresight. She was prepared now. That was what 4 days in a hotel room with a room service receipt and a different cologne had produced in her. A willingness to look at everything she had been choosing for 3 years, not to see. "Tell me about the meetings," she said. When Gerald finished reading, he set the document down. He reached for a second section of the folder. "We have 4 confirmed instances over an 8-month period. The first was in February. Most recent was 3 weeks ago." He slid a single typed page across the table. Dates, locations, brief notations. The kind of document that communicates not warmth, but the cold architecture of fact. The entity that approached Marcus identified itself as representing a private equity interest. The representative gave a name, your husband, does not use professionally, which is how he believed the meetings would remain unconnected to him. He underestimated Marcus. Who keeps records of every contact in the way of someone who has been in business long enough to know that the conversation you think is casual is frequently the one that matters most? What was Daniel's offer? He represented that you had decided to liquidate the trust stake and wished to avoid the complications of a public transaction. He asked Marcus to facilitate a private sale to the fund he claimed to represent. For how much? Significantly below market value. Gerald's voice remained even, without editorial comment. But his eyes said something more precise than his words. Approximately 60 cents on the dollar. The arrangement would have required Marcus to accept the premise that you had authorized the transaction, and that no direct communication with you was necessary to proceed, which Marcus declined. Marcus declined, and also noted the meeting, and also, because is a man of some instinct, made preliminary inquiries with our office about the status of your father's estate. She sat with that for a moment. Marcus Hale, whom she had not spoken to in 2 years, had been quietly watching a door she hadn't known she was standing behind. She thought about all the people her father had put in the world before he left it. The particular network of careful, principled, watchful people, and she felt something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, and was perhaps both of those things together, pressed into a shape that had no name yet. And Sasha, she said. Gerald paused, the pause of a man who has been coming to this part of the conversation, and has prepared himself for the specific difficulty of it. He removed a second page from the folder and held it without sliding it across yet. Sasha Merritt made the introduction. She has a professional relationship with Daniel that predates the marriage by 2 years. Her family has held a minor equity position in a peripheral Voss Holdings vehicle since before your wedding. She attended the same industry event as Marcus Hale in September of last year. The seatings was arranged through a mutual contact, whose connection to Daniel can be documented. Claire looked at the page now in front of her. It was a contact record, a digital log of meeting attendance with names annotated. Sasha Merritt's name was there, and Marcus Hale's, and the event, a private finance dinner at a club on East 62nd Street that Claire had not attended because Daniel had told her it was a bore. A room full of people talking about money they all already had. Not worth the evening. She had stayed home. She had read a book in the sitting room and gone to bed before 11. She had believed him. That was the thing she was sitting with now, not the betrayal itself, which was large and ugly, but also, in a certain cold light, comprehensible. People did this. Men with Daniel's particular combination of ambition and insecurity and a fundamental confusion between wanting and deserving did this, had always done this, would continue to do this. She understood that. What she was sitting with was not that he had done it, but that she had let him, had known, somewhere beneath the level of her willingness to look, and had folded that knowing carefully and put it away, year after year, in the place she kept the things she was not yet ready to face. She had used the marriage as an anesthetic. She understood that now. Her father had died, and she had been afraid. Afraid of the grief, and afraid of the world without him in it, and afraid, most specifically, of the version of her own life she would have to inhabit if she looked at it clearly. And she had stayed. She had stayed in the Greenwich house and attended the dinners, and let Daniel reorganize her world into a shape he found convenient. And she had told herself that this was what stability looked like, that the grief was making things seem worse than they were. She had remained so successfully that she had nearly remained herself out of her own inheritance. He needed the stake, she said. Not a question. The stake is 34%, Gerald said. Currently worth approximately $42 million at market valuation. But the more significant issue is control. Your father retained a board seat with the stake, which passes to you on transfer, in a company of Whitmore's structure. 34% with a board seat constitutes effective veto power over any major transaction. If Daniel's fund had acquired it at any price, he would have had the ability to block or facilitate acquisitions at will, including one that his fund's other investors have been pursuing for the better part of a year. The riverfront development, she said. Gerald looked at her with a very slight recalibration of his expression. You knew about that. I heard him mention it on a call in July, she said. He thought I was asleep. It struck me because it was a project my father had specifically declined to pursue when it was first proposed 8 years ago. I didn't know Daniel was connected to it. He is connected to it through 3 layers of intermediary. She thought about July. She had been in the garden when she heard him on the phone, through the open window of his study. She had thought about going inside and asking. And then she had thought about the last 3 times she had asked questions about his business dealings, and the way he had answered them, patiently, a little carefully, in the tone of a man explaining something to someone he loves, but does not quite regard as an equal. And she had picked up her book instead and gone inside through the kitchen door and made herself a cup of tea and gone to bed early. She had thought, it's probably nothing. She had thought. I trust him. She had not trusted him. That was the clarifying pain of it. She had been afraid of what trusting her own instincts would require her to do, and she had called that fear trust, and she had lived inside it for 3 years. What happens to him if we invoke the clause? The trust transfers to you immediately and entirely. The board seat activates. Marcus Hale will formally introduce you to the board at the earliest scheduled meeting, which is next month. But your rights as a stakeholder begin at the moment of transfer. Gerald folded his hands on the table. Daniel has no legal standing to contest the trust itself, its existence, its terms, or its activation. Any claim he might make would require him to first explain, in legal proceedings, why he was conducting negotiations to acquire the stake under a false identity, which opens a set of complications he will not want opened. Miss Merritt made representations to Marcus Hale that you had authorized transactions you had not authorized. That is actionable in several directions. She also made those representations in the presence of Marcus's personal assistant, who took notes as a professional habit. Claire looked at the second document again, the annotated contact log. Sasha Merritt's name in the same clinical typeface as everything else, reduced to a fact among facts, which was somehow both less and more than she had expected it to feel. She had met Sasha twice in the 3 years of her marriage, once at a gallery opening in Chelsea, where Sasha had been pointed out as the daughter of one of the Voss Holdings partners, a young woman making her own way in finance. She had been direct, well-dressed, with an intensity of focus that Claire had read, at the time, as ambition and admired, without examining too carefully. The second time had been a dinner the previous Christmas, a large gathering in the Hamptons, where Sasha had been seated 3 people away, and Claire had noticed, without naming what she was noticing, that Daniel's laugh was different when he was turned in that direction. She had named it now. Gerald, she said, I need you to tell me one more thing. The Riverfront project. If Daniel's fund acquires my stake before tonight's gala, before I meet with Marcus, does the activation clause still hold? The clause activates on the confirmation of your pregnancy and the personal meeting with Marcus Hale, Gerald said. Both triggers must be met within the 72-hour window. Your pregnancy was confirmed and documented 3 weeks ago by your physician. The clock started Monday, when I reached you directly. The meeting with Marcus must happen by Monday morning at the latest. He looked at her steadily. It is currently Friday. Tonight is the gala, she said. Tonight is the gala. Gerald confirmed. Marcus will be there. Daniel will be there. Every significant stakeholder in the Whitmore Holdings Board will be there, as guests of the Hale Group, because Marcus arranged the invitation list with some care for a reason I believe you now understand. He has been waiting for you. Claire. Since I called him in October and told him the pregnancy had been confirmed, he has been holding a door open. She thought about Marcus's voice on the phone the previous evening. I was beginning to think you wouldn't. Simply stating a fact, the way men of his particular generation state facts, plainly, without the performance of emotion, trusting that the plainness itself communicates the weight. She put the coffee cup down a final time. She looked at the documents spread across the table. The trust, the activation clause, the contact records, the whole paper architecture of her father's foresight, and she thought about the navy dress on the back of the bathroom door, and the way her mother had stood in rooms, and the way the baby had moved last night in the small hours when everything was quiet. "I'm going tonight," she said, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with the simple acknowledgement of a man who had spent 31 years in this work, and who could recognize, when he saw it, the moment a person stopped deciding and started acting, which were not the same thing and never had been. "One more thing," he said. He reached into the folder a final time and withdrew a sealed envelope, smaller than the others, plain, white, without markings. "This came through the firm 2 weeks ago, addressed to you via our office. We did not open it, as it is personal correspondence. The postmark is from a Connecticut address. I don't know what it contains, but I thought you should have it before tonight." She looked at the envelope. She turned it over. On the back flap, in very small handwriting she did not recognize, "Please read this before the gala." She looked at it for a long moment. She put it in her bag, unopened. She had enough to carry today without adding more, and whatever SM had written. And she was beginning to form an idea about what those initials stood for. Would hold until she had what she needed from tonight. It would wait. Things waited. When you needed them to. The ones that mattered always did. She shook Gerald's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. For everything you've held for 3 years. Your father would have done it himself," Gerald said, "if he'd had the time." She took the elevator down alone and stepped onto Madison Avenue in the October morning, and she moved with the deliberateness of someone who has an appointment to keep and sufficient time to keep it. She went to the tailor's and then went back to the hotel. She had one more stop to make, and after that she would spend the afternoon in the careful, methodical way she spent time when the time mattered. The afternoon had a quality she recognized. The specific stillness of time, held between what has already been decided and what has not yet happened, when there is nothing useful left to do except inhabit the hours between without wasting them on doubt. She passed this afternoon trying to read, until she understood that the words were not reaching her in any useful sequence, and that what she actually needed was to do something with her hands. Chapter 3. The dress she wore for no one else. She made another cup of tea, properly, this time, the way her mother had shown her, with the patience most people no longer extended to tea. And she stood at the window with the cup and watched the city, and gave herself permission not to think productively for 20 minutes. She thought about her mother instead. Evelyn Whitmore had been a woman of great stillness and great precision, which peoples had sometimes mistaken for coldness, and which was, in fact, the opposite of coldness. It was the particular warmth of someone who took every situation seriously enough to be fully present in it, without performance, without the noise of performed reaction. She had worn the navy dress. This dress, the one hanging on the bathroom door in the next room, to a dinner in the spring of the year Claire was 12. A dinner at which she understood only much later. Something important had been decided about the direction of her father's company. Claire had seen photographs from that evening, found in a box years after both her parents were gone. Her mother at the center of a group of men in black tie, the only woman in the frame, holding a glass of champagne she was not drinking, with an expression of complete and composed attentiveness that had nothing to do with the social performance around her. She had looked like someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. She went to her bag and took out the envelope. Plain white, smaller than the others. The careful, small handwriting on the back. "Please read this before the gala." She had been carrying it for 5 hours, and she had not opened it because she had not been ready. And she was not certain she was ready now. But ready was not the relevant consideration anymore. The relevant consideration was that whoever SM was, and she was almost certain she knew, the person had gone to the considerable trouble of routing a letter through letter, Fitch and Caldwell, to reach her, which meant this was not an accident or an impulse, but a decision that had required some preparation. She opened it. The handwriting inside was different from the inscription on the back. less compressed, more fluid, as though the message itself had been written in a state of something, while the address had been written in control. She read it once quickly to find the shape of it, then read it again from the beginning, slowly. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I am not writing to ask for it. I am writing because I made a mistake I understood was a mistake even while I was making it, which is not a defense, but which I think you deserve to know. I thought I was being strategic. I was told what the situation was, and I believed it because I wanted it to believe it, and because I have spent 4 years in an industry that rewards the people who move quickly and ask questions later. And I told myself this was the same. It is not the same. There is going to be a moment at the gala when Daniel will try to use me against you. He will ask me to say something to Marcus Hale about your intentions with the trust. He has been coaching me on what to say for 2 weeks, and I have been going along with it because I did not know how to stop without losing everything I thought I had. I understand now that what I thought I had was already gone, that it was always going to be gone, and that Daniel is the reason for that. Not you. I don't know what you're planning. I don't know if you're planning anything. But you should know that whatever I say in that room tonight, Marcus Hale will not hear it the way Daniel expects him to. I have already spoken to his office. I have already told them what I was asked to do, whatever happens next. I have asked that it be known that I did not do it freely, and that I told someone before it happened. I am sorry. That is all I know how to say. I am very sorry. Claire read it a third time. She set it down on the bedside table. She looked out the window at the afternoon, which was beginning to shift toward evening at the edges, the light going golden and lateral, the city's surfaces collecting it and turning it something close to beautiful. She thought about Sasha Merritt, the intensity of focus she had noticed at the gallery opening, which she had admired, the laugh she had noticed at the Christmas dinner, which had told her something she had refused to examine. She thought about a woman 4 years younger than her who had made a decision she understood was wrong even while making it. Because the alternative, Jesus, required losing something she had been working toward for long enough that the working had become confused with the wanting, she thought. I know that country, she thought. I spent 3 years in it. She did not forgive Sasha Merritt, but she folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her bag with the specific deliberateness of someone who is keeping a record. Whatever I say in that room tonight, Marcus Hale will not hear it the way Daniel expects him to. Claire moved to the bathroom. The ritual of it mattered to her. She had learned this about herself late and valued it accordingly. That the physical preparation for a significant moment was not vanity, but a form of concentration, a method of arriving at the threshold of something important in a specific state. Her mother had called it putting yourself together, which was a phrase she had always said with a certain precision, as though the togetherness were a real thing that had to be actively assembled. She showered and dressed her hair, which she wore down, her mother's decision in the photographs, and she did her makeup with the same attention she would give to any task where the details were the point. She applied the lipstick last, a dark rose, nearly burgundy, the color her mother had worn in the photographs and which Claire had, until tonight, always thought was too much for her. It was not too much. It was, she understood, looking at herself in the bathroom mirror, with a clarity that surprised her. Exactly right. She went to the closet and lifted the dress from its hanger with the care of something that has earned being handled carefully. She put it on. The bodice settled with the assurance of well-made things. The tailor had done her work so precisely that the dress did not require adjusting. It simply arrived where it was supposed to be and stayed there. She reached behind herself and drew the zip up with the practiced motion of a person accustomed to dressing alone, which she was. Which was one of the 10,000 small facts about her marriage that she had been noting without naming for years. She smoothed the fabric once along her ribs, and then stepped back and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. She looked like someone she recognized from a very long time ago. Not her mother, or not only her mother, but herself, in the specific version of herself that had existed before 8 years, of making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what she ought to be. She had put that person away gradually, across years, in the increments of accommodation that don't feel like loss while they're happening, because each one is small enough to rationalize. She was taking her back out now. This was what she was doing, standing in a hotel room in her mother's dress at 4:30 in the afternoon. She touched her stomach briefly, gently, through the fabric of the dress. "Let's go," she said. She left the hotel at 5:20 through the side entrance on 54th Street, which came out on the street level without passing the front desk. She had a car booked under her maiden name, Whitmore, through a car service Gerald's office had arranged. A detail that mattered less for secrecy than for the principle of it. She was arriving tonight as herself, and herself had a name that preceded the one she'd been living inside for 3 years. The car was a black town car, not remarkable. She sat in the back and watched the city move past the windows and permitted herself precisely 1 minute of being afraid. 1 minute, which she had read somewhere was the appropriate emotional budget for fear. In situations where the outcome is already decided and the only variable is the quality of the nerve you bring to it. She let the fear be present, acknowledged what it was carrying, and then she folded it away. Daniel arrived at 6:04. She had been watching the blue awning from across the street when the car pulled up. He stepped out first. He was wearing the gray suit, the one he kept for events where he wanted to look like someone who had arrived without effort, which he never did. She had been preparing herself for this particular moment, had rehearsed her own stillness for it, and the preparation held. She looked at Daniel, crossing a red carpet in October light with the body language of a man who believes the evening is still arranged in his favor. Then Sasha stepped out of the car behind him. Claire had spent preparation energy on this moment, too. The preparation held. She looked at Sasha Merritt, who was wearing a black dress, understated, and felt almost nothing of what she had expected to feel. What she felt instead was more interesting. It was the particular sensation of a thing that has been abstract finally becoming concrete, and the concreteness being less damaging than the abstraction had been. The reality was someone who had written 3 paragraphs in fluid handwriting and signed her full name to them and sent them through a lawyer's office because she was afraid and had made a mistake and did not know what else to do. The reality was someone who had, at the end of it, told the truth. Daniel put his hand at the small of Sasha's back, and they walked through the doors together, and the photographers took their photographs, and the evening advanced. Claire waited another 4 minutes. Then she crossed the street. The lobby of the Hale Group building was floored in dark marble and occupied by the particular atmosphere of old money entertaining itself, quietly, with excellent flowers and no visible effort. The effort having been expended in advance by people paid not to make it visible. A young woman in black took her name at the door. Whitmore, Claire had said, simply that. And the young woman had found it immediately on the list and looked up at her with a brief expression of recalibration. "Of course. Ms. Hale asked me to let him know when you arrived. He's just through those doors with the other guests. If you'd prefer, there's a small reception area to your left where you can wait, and I can have him come to you." "I'll wait," Claire said. She stood in the reception area rather than sat. She looked through the glass into the main cocktail space. Beyond, the room held approximately 80 people. She found Daniel within 15 seconds, because she had always been able to find Daniel in a room without effort, which was one of the things she had loved first about him, and which now felt like simply a capacity of her attention rather than an expression of feeling. He was near the bar, talking to Martin Whitfield with the posture of someone who is watching the room over the shoulder of the person he is speaking to. He was looking for Marcus. She found Sasha 5 seconds later. Sasha was already across the room. She was standing at the edge of the near-table cluster, with the specific stillness of someone who has taken a position and is holding it, not browsing, not floating, but positioned. Her body was angled toward a small group of 3 people near the tall windows on the east wall. And at the center of that group was of about 70 with silver hair and the physical bearing of someone who has spent decades taking up precisely the amount of space he intends to take up, and no more. She watched Sasha cross the space between them, watched her stop at the edge of the group with the practiced ease of someone entering a conversation she has a right to enter, watched Marcus Hale turn slightly to include her, his expression as settled and measuring as it had sounded on the phone. She could not hear what was being said. She watched the shapes of it. Sasha speaking. A paragraph's worth of measured sentences. Marcus listened with head slightly inclined in the manner of someone who listens with full attention and gives nothing back until ready. Sasha again. Shorter this time. Marcus nodding once. Slowly, his right hand was at his side. He was holding a small glass of water, but his left hand was in his jacket pocket, and it had been there since Sasha approached, and it did not move. He was recording. She had not known the specific mechanism, had not known what he would do, but she was not surprised. Marcus Hale had spent 40 years in private equity with a reputation for 2 things: extraordinary patience and a complete absence of the kind of trust that could be exploited. Sasha finished speaking. Marcus said something brief. Sasha's expression shifted in the way of someone who has received a response that does not match what was expected, and she recalibrated and said something further. Marcus listened, said something else, and then he turned his head, not toward Sasha, but toward the door, and his gaze moved across the glass of the lobby window with the unhurried direction of someone who knows exactly where they are looking. He was looking for her. She understood that from the direction and quality of the turn. Sasha said one more thing. Marcus turned back to her and spoke. 2 or 3 sentences, measured, without warmth. Whatever he said. It concluded the conversation. Sasha received it with the expression of someone processing an outcome that was neither what she had hoped for nor entirely what she had feared, and she excused herself and moved back toward the center of the room. Claire watched her go. It's done, she thought. Whatever she said. It's recorded. Whatever he said back. It closed her out. She moved from the alcove to the lobby entrance. The doors to the cocktail room opened. Marcus Hale crossed the lobby toward her. He was taller than she had expected. He moved with the deliberateness of someone for whom movement is never thoughtless. And his expression, as he covered the distance between them, was not warm in the performative sense, but was warm in the way that matters more. Attentive, present, focused on her, as though she were the only thing in the room worth looking at. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, with the quietness of something that does not need volume to carry, "You look exactly like him when you're about to walk into a room and change something." She had heard him say something like this before, on the phone last night, about her father. But in person, looking at a man who had known her father for 30 years, and was looking at her now with the expression of someone seeing a continuity rather than a loss, it landed differently. It landed in the place that grief keeps its permanent address, which was not a sad place exactly, but was a place that required some steadiness to stand in. She was steady. Are we ready? The recording is already with Gerald's office, Marcus said. He glanced back briefly toward the room, then back to her. Miss Merritt told me you had authorized the transfer of the stake and wished me to expedite the process without direct contact with you, as you were, in her words, finding the situation emotionally difficult, and had asked Daniel to manage the details on your behalf. She was scripted, Claire said. She was scripted. Marcus agreed. And then she deviated from the script at the end, which was interesting. She told me to make sure you knew I tried to help. Then she looked at me as though she expected me to understand something she hadn't actually said. She wrote me a letter, Claire said. Then you understand it too, Marcus said. One more thing. His voice shifted register slightly, became less professional, more the voice she had heard on the phone. When he had told her, she looked like her father. James asked me once what I thought about Daniel. Not when you were engaged, but before, when things were still. He asked me what I thought, and I told him what I thought. And he nodded and said he hoped he was wrong, but he was going to make sure you had what you needed if he wasn't. He looked at her with the expression of a man paying a debt. He wasn't wrong. I am sorry, he wasn't wrong. But he loved you very carefully, and what he built for you is very solid. And you are here now. And that is what he wanted. Claire held that for a moment. She pressed her lips together, once, firmly, and then released the pressure. And in doing so, released something else. Not the grief, which was not releasable in a lobby on a Friday evening, but the weight of being alone in it, which was different, and which was what her father had been working against all along. "Let's go in," she said. Marcus Hale extended his arm. She took it. The doors opened, and the room beyond them was full of light and conversation, and 80 people. And then the room's sound shifted in the way that a room's sound shifts when something happens inside it that changes the nature of what the room is. And Claire Whitmore walked forward into the light of it with her mother's dress, and her father's preparation, and her own particular quality of stillness. There is a kind of silence that is not an absence of sound, but an alteration of it. A moment when the ambient noise of a room, the layered accumulation of 80 simultaneous conversations, and the movement of glasses, and the small social machinery of an industry gathering, does not stop but changes register, becomes aware of itself, becomes the silence underneath its own sound. It is not a silence that can be manufactured. Chapter 4. What the Room Remembered. It arrives or it does not. And when it does, every person in the room feels it before they understand it. The way you feel a change in pressure before you hear the thunder. That was what happened when Claire Whitmore walked through the doors of the Hale Group's annual gala on the arm of Marcus Hale. She felt it arrive. She had been half prepared for it, had understood, in the abstract, that the entrance would have weight, that the room would register Marcus's arm and her name, and the gap between what was expected and what had arrived. But the abstraction had not quite prepared her for the physical reality of 80 people's attention, moving in the same direction at the same time, which had its own sensation. Like weather, she kept walking. The room's layout worked the way Marcus had described it. Round tables for dinner, arranged in the rear half, already set. White cloths and low arrangements of autumn flowers, amber and white. The cocktail gathering in the front, thinning now, as people had begun to move toward their assigned seats for the meal. She did not look to her right. She counted 8 steps. Then she heard it. The particular quality of pause that is distinct from a pause caused by the natural movement of a speech. And she permitted herself to look. Daniel was at the small podium near the far end of the room. He had been mid-sentence when they came through the doors. She could tell this from the way the pause arrived. Not at the end of a thought, not at a transition point, but inside a sentence, at the place where the sentence had been going somewhere, and had instead simply stopped. He was holding a single index card he had not needed to consult, because Daniel Voss had been giving remarks at events like these for long enough that he could do it without notes, could walk into a room and read the assembly and find the precise version of himself that the room wanted and produce it without apparent effort. That was one of the things he was genuinely good at. It was also the thing that had made his deceptions so durable. He was very good at being exactly what a room required, and rooms rarely required the truth. The room required something else now. She watched him locate her, not slowly, not with the scanning motion of someone searching, but with the immediate animal directness of a person who has been looking for one specific thing their entire time in the room, and has just found it somewhere they were not expecting to find it. His eyes moved from her face to Marcus's arm under her hand, and then back to her face in the specific sequence of someone assembling information they did not want to assemble and arriving, against their will, at its meaning. The index card came down. He had been trained by years of corporate governance and investor relations not to show the wrong thing in rooms that were watching. He was a gifted practitioner of that training. But there is a calibrated threshold for every performance, a level of disruption beyond which the mechanism is simply not fast enough. And Claire Whitmore, arriving in her mother's navy dress on Marcus Hale's arm, was several registers past that threshold. He stood at the podium for 2 seconds that were, in the compressed timeline of public attention, the equivalent of much longer. And he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the room registered both of these things simultaneously. Martin Whitfield was the first person she knew to speak. He said something to his wife, Louise, who turned to look, and whose expression moved through several phases in quick succession in the specific way of someone updating a model they had been operating on for some time. And then he looked again at Marcus and at Claire and then at Daniel at the podium. And something in his face completed its calculation and settled into the expression of a man who has been watching a situation for a while and has just understood what he was actually watching. There were other people she identified in rapid sequence. Arthur Kane, who held a senior position on 3 boards with Whitmore family connections and who looked at Marcus's arm with the focused attention of someone reading a document. Patricia Lowe, who had been her father's attorney's opposing counsel once and who was looking at Claire with an expression of careful, professional interest. 2 journalists near the east windows who were no longer writing anything down because writing was slower than watching, and watching was what the moment required. She heard Daniel make the recovery. He said something about the disruptions of a lively industry and made a brief, practiced joke, and several people who did not yet understand what they had witnessed laughed with the reflex of people grateful for a restoration of the familiar register. And the room's attention distributed itself again. But it did not fully return to Daniel. The moment had created a residue, a heightened awareness that redistributed itself evenly across the space. And people's eyes kept returning to the place where the disruption had originated. The table where Claire Whitmore was sitting, beside Marcus Hale, with the specific composure of someone who has arrived where she intended to arrive. Marcus had planned the dinner with the understanding that the appropriate moment for the substantive part of the evening was after the main course and before the dessert, during the brief interval that formal dinners create for themselves, the pause between things, when the room is fed and not yet ready to leave. He had told her he intended to say exactly what was true, which was that the Whitmore Family Trust had formally transferred to Claire Whitmore effective the previous Monday, and that he was pleased to introduce her to the room in her capacity as a principal stakeholder in Whitmore Family Real Estate Holdings, and that he looked forward to her involvement in the board's work going forward. Nothing beyond the facts. The facts were sufficient. She had agreed. The situation did not require argument. It required presence. The main course was sea bass, which she ate approximately half of, because her appetite had been a managed resource since Monday. The conversation at her table, Marcus to her left, 2 board members and their spouses across, Arthur Kane to her right, had the quality of conversation that has an awareness operating beneath its surface, like a river that looks calm from above because the speed is all underwater. Arthur Kane asked her 3 questions about her work before the estate and her knowledge of the company's operations, and listened to the answers with an attention that told her he was filing them somewhere. The board member across, whose name was Raymond Chu, asked 1 question, which was whether she intended to take an active or advisory role, and listened to her answer with the expression of a man conducting, very rapidly, a private assessment of someone he will be sitting across from on a regular basis. Active, she had said, simply, and Raymond Chu had nodded once, very slightly, with a nod of someone reaching a conclusion. She looked at Daniel once during dinner. She had permitted herself this, one deliberate look, at a moment of her choosing, not reactive, but chosen. He was 3 tables away, and slightly to her left. He was wearing the expression of a man who is fully present at a table while being entirely absent from it. The expression she had been watching him wear for 2 years. At events where something was wrong, but the something was not yet available to discuss. She had once interpreted this expression as private stress of the professional variety, and had felt concern for him when she saw it. She understood it differently now. She looked for long enough to be certain of what she was seeing, and then she looked away. She looked at her plate. She picked up her fork. She ate the rest of the sea base. In the interval before dessert, Marcus stood. He did not use the podium. He simply stood at the head of the table, which was sufficient, because Marcus Hale in a room was not someone who required additional height or amplification to be heard. He had the quality of certain people who have spent decades being worth listening to. The room registered his standing before he had said a word, and conversation thinned and then stilled with the naturalness of water finding its level. "I want to take a moment," Marcus said, "to make a brief introduction that some of you may have been anticipating, and others may find informative. Many of you knew James Whitmore," Marcus said. James was a man who built things carefully and well, and who understood, with the particular patience of someone who has been in this industry long enough to see cycles complete themselves, that what you build is only as durable as the foundation it stands on. He built Whitmore Family Real Estate Holdings over 30 years, on a foundation that has survived several market corrections, one significant legal challenge in 2011, and more recently a period of some uncertainty regarding the trust structure he established before his death. That uncertainty has now been resolved. The trust has transferred, as of Monday of this week, to its intended beneficiary. He looked at Claire, not because it had been asked of her, not because it had been explicitly discussed, but because she understood, from the quality of the moment and the precision with which Marcus had constructed it, that standing was the right response, that the room needed to see her on her feet, at her full height, in the light, not as someone being introduced to them, but as someone presenting herself to be seen clearly, which was different. She was aware of the room looking at her. She was aware of Arthur Kane beside her, who had set his dessert fork down. She was aware of the two journalists near the east wall, both of whom had shifted their positions. She was aware, at the edge of her awareness, of Daniel, though she did not look at him. She held the room's attention with the specific quality of stillness that was not practiced at all, but simply herself unobstructed. Herself without the layer of accommodation and reduction that had accumulated across 8 years making herself compatible with someone else's dimensions. Claire Whitmore, Marcus said, is the majority stakeholder and board seat holder of Whitmore Family Real Estate Holdings, effective Monday, October 9th. She will be joining the board at the November meeting. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the room with the expression of a man closing a statement. James would have been very pleased. The room did what rooms do in the moment immediately following a significant piece of information. It processed, audibly, in the form of a low collective exhalation of conversation that rose quickly and then resolved into the normal register. 100 simultaneous recalibrations audible as a kind of elevated white noise. She heard her name twice in the first 15 seconds, used by people not at her table, in tones of varying register, surprised, recalibrated, considering. She heard the name Whitmore used 3 times in the first 30 seconds, by people who were connecting the current moment to prior knowledge. Raymond Chu leaned across the table and said, "Welcome to the board, Ms." He said it with the simple finality of someone who has completed an assessment and reached a verdict. And she thanked him, and meant it. Arthur Kane, to her right, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have timed that exactly the same way." She pressed her lips together and smiled, which was the most she could safely offer in that particular direction. Daniel reached her at 9:12. She had been standing near the east wall in a small conversation with Patricia Lowe and one of the journalists, And then Patricia Lowe had registered something over Claire's shoulder and made a brief, practiced excuse. And the journalist had said, "I'll follow up with your office," and moved away. And then it was Daniel. He had a drink in his hand. The drink was mostly full, which told her he had not been drinking heavily, that whatever he was bringing to this conversation was not the courage of alcohol, but whatever was actually left of him after the evening. He looked, for the first time in a very long time, like someone she could read clearly, not like the managed, polished version she had been living alongside for 3 years. He looked like a man who had been running a performance all evening and had just walked off the stage and was still in costume, but could no longer quite maintain the character. The way performers sometimes look in the wings. The face of the role beginning to show its seams, he said. "Claire." She looked at him. There was a full second before he spoke again, during which she understood that he was deciding, in real time, what version of this conversation he intended to have. She saw him move through the options with the specific quality of someone sorting through a hand of cards and finding them insufficient, but trying anyway. "What you just did," he said, and his voice was very quiet, intended for her only. The voice of their marriage, rather than the voice of his public self, is something we can't take back. You understand that. She let that land without responding. "I know I have done things," he said, and she noted the construction. Things, not named things, not catalogued things, not the specific and documented history of what he had done, but the collective abstract noun that allows a person to acknowledge the class of action without committing to its particulars. "I know we have things to address, but this could have been done privately. You chose to do it here, in front of." "Yes," she said. She let the silence have its full duration. She was not filling it for his comfort. She was simply standing in it and letting it be what it was, which was the first fully honest exchange of weight that had passed between them in longer than she could accurately calculate. "I chose to do it here," she said, "because this is where you chose to bring this. You brought it to this building, to this room, to this table, to Marcus Hale. You chose the terrain. I arrived in it." Daniel looked at her. She held his look without flinching and without softness and without the residual warmth of a person who still wants something from the conversation, because she did not want anything from this conversation except its conclusion. And the conclusion was already complete. And the only remaining question was how long it would take him to understand that. "There is nothing here to repair," she said. That was all. She moved toward the coat check at the far end of the lobby, walking with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has finished the thing they came to do and is simply completing the motion now, without urgency and without performance. She was aware of the room behind her, was aware that Daniel had not followed her, that he was standing where she had left him, with the drink in his hand, and the evening arranged around him in a shape he did not yet fully understand. Though the understanding was coming, it was coming the way most true things come to people who have been successfully avoiding them, inevitably, and all at once, and without the mercy of being gradual. She collected her coat. She put it on. She nodded to the young woman at the coat check, who nodded back with the professional blankness of someone who has seen many things in this lobby over many years of events and has decided that none of them are her business. The street outside was cold in the clean way of October evenings, the air carrying the specific quality of the city at night in autumn, the clarity of it, the way the cold made the distance visible, made the lights sharper and the edges more defined. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her coat not yet buttoned, letting the air find her, letting the temperature be information. She did not move toward the car immediately. She stood on the sidewalk and put her hand over her coat, over the place where something small and determined and entirely unknown to the evening she had just passed through was continuing, with complete indifference, to board seats and trust documents and the specific geography of public rooms, the uninterruptible business of becoming. She thought about the letter in her bag, which she would answer in the morning. She thought about Gerald, who would be awake and waiting for her confirmation, and she sent him a text. One word, done, and watched the screen show, delivered. She thought about Marcus, who was still inside, probably already in the next conversation, moving through the world like water, finding the next useful channel. And she thought, I will write him a proper letter, the way my father would have. She thought about her father. She thought about him with the specific quality of grief that is available to people who have fully inhabited the loss, not the acute, destabilizing grief of recent loss, but the settled, textured grief of someone for whom the absence has become a known quantity, a fixed geography in the interior landscape, something you navigate around and sometimes sit beside, and which never fully loses its weight, but which does not require you to stop moving. She thought about the trust, the structure he had built quietly and with care, the specific act of loving someone by ensuring they would be all right without you. She thought about what it meant that he had not told her, that he had trusted her to arrive here on her own, when she was ready, and had simply ensured that when she arrived there would be something solid to stand on. She was standing on it. She took a long breath of October air. She looked down the street, the ordinary street, the city performing its evening in all directions, lights and movement, and the deep ordinary noise of a million simultaneous lives conducting themselves with complete indifference to what had just happened in a limestone building on East 65th Street. She moved toward the car. She got in. The driver pulled into traffic without speaking. She watched the building recede through the rear window. The blue awning, the red carpet strip, the light inside the tall windows, showing the still assembled dinner, the conversation going on, the evening continuing for the 80 people it still had. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes and did not sleep and did not think, quite so much as occupy the specific quality of stillness that follows a very long and very precise effort. She was in that moment. She stayed in it, carefully, for the length of the drive. In the lobby of the Meridian, the night clerk greeted her by name, and she thanked him by name, because she had learned his name on Monday and believed that learning people's names was the baseline of treating them correctly. She moved down the corridor and stopped at the door of suite 1408 and stood there for a moment, with the key card not yet raised to the panel. She thought, this is the last night I spend in this room. She let herself in. She set her bag on the chair. She took off her coat and hung it. She stood in the center of the room in her mother's dress and looked at the window, at the city beyond it, at all that light making all that distance bright. She put her hand against the dress. She held it there. We did it tonight, she said. Not to the room, not to the city, to the only other person who had been present for all of it, who had been present since Monday, since October, since the beginning of what this had been, and who would arrive in full in the spring, into a world that had been made different before their arrival by the work of the months before, by a woman who had dressed carefully and walked into a room and stood on the solid ground her father had built for her. She unzipped the dress and hung it with the care it deserved. She got into bed. She lay in the center of it and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time since Monday, the weight of the week settle in at the mattress beneath her rather than onto her shoulders. She was very tired. She was also, beneath the tiredness, in a layer that required more searching to find, but was unmistakably present. Something she recognized as the specific quality of being where you are supposed to be, doing what you were built to do, in alignment with the best version of who you actually are. She had not felt it in a very long time. She closed her eyes. The week after the gala had the quality of water settling after a stone has been dropped into it, the disturbance radiating outward in all directions, moving through the industry's information network with the invisible speed that significant financial news always moves. Arriving at breakfast tables and morning calls and assistant-mediated inboxes before most people had finished their coffee. Claire did not track it closely. She did not need to. Gerald tracked it, and Marcus's office tracked it. And the two journalists who had been present at the dinner filed their pieces by the following Monday. Both pieces ran on Tuesday. Both used the word reclaim. Chapter 5, The Price of Everything He Chose. Neither mentioned Daniel by name, though the context of the trust transfer and its timing made certain things available to anyone who chose to read carefully, which was to say everyone who mattered in the industry read them, which was to say everyone who needed to understood within 48 hours of publication. She read them in the apartment on the Upper West Side that she had moved into on Saturday. The apartment was her grandmother's, had been her grandmother's, technically. It had passed to her mother, and then to her, managed by a rental agency for the 4 years of her marriage, because Daniel had preferred Greenwich, and she had not argued. Not because she preferred Greenwich, but because she had not, at that point, been the kind of woman who argued about where she lived. It was on the 7th floor of a building she had loved since childhood, with windows that faced west over the park and received the afternoon light in a way that her grandmother had always described as the building's finest quality and its primary reason for her continued residence there for 42 years. It was smaller than the Greenwich house. It was, without question, entirely hers. She made coffee in the kitchen with her grandmother's coffee pot, and she read the articles, and she looked at the park, and she felt, with a clarity that surprised her by its completeness, that she was home. The call from Sasha Merritt's attorney came on Wednesday morning. Gerald had suggested a neutral location. Claire had declined. For the same reason, she had declined neutral territory during the Gala planning. Not from pride exactly, but from the understanding that the spaces in which significant things are decided have meaning. And she wanted this particular thing decided in a space she understood and trusted. They met at Fitch and Caldwell, in the conference room with the winter landscape painting, and the tall, narrow windows and 40 years of consequential decisions in the quality of its air. Sasha arrived 10 minutes late. Claire noted this without assigning it too much weight. The attorney who accompanied her was young, in a suit that had been purchased to communicate a seniority he had not yet earned. Sasha herself looked like someone who had not slept well in 8 days, which was probably accurate, and who had dressed carefully for this meeting in the way of someone who understands that how you present yourself in a difficult room is part of the argument you are making. The attorney opened. He had a prepared statement, 2 pages, which he summarized with practiced fluency. The substance. Sasha Merritt had been acting in good faith on behalf of a client, Daniel Voss, in a professional capacity. The representation she had made to Marcus Hale had been made in the genuine belief that they were accurate, that if any material misrepresentation had occurred, it had occurred as a result of incomplete information provided to her by her client, and that she bore no independent liability for the consequences. Gerald, Claire said. Gerald reached into the folder in front of him and withdrew a small device, which he set on the table without comment. He pressed play. The room held Marcus Hale's voice, tinny but clear, through the small speaker, asking Sasha a question she had not expected him to ask after she had delivered her prepared lines. And Claire communicated this directly to you, her exact words. And then Sasha's voice, which had the particular quality of someone who is further into a constructed narrative than they had intended to go, and is now maintaining it because stopping would require explaining the construction. Yes, she was very clear. She said she wanted Daniel to handle everything. She didn't want to be involved in the business side. It was too much right now, with everything she's been managing personally. And then, 3 minutes further in, Sasha's voice again, and this time carrying a different quality, the quality of the deviation. I need you to know I'm going to say what I was asked to say tonight. And I need you to know, I'm telling you this now, so there is a record of it, that I was asked to say it, and I knew it wasn't true when I was asked. And I'm saying it anyway, because I don't know how to not say it, And I'm sorry for that. And then Marcus, very quietly, I understand. I've already noted this conversation. Every part of it. Gerald stopped the recording. Sasha's attorney had stopped his summary. At the moment the recording began, he was looking at the device with the expression of someone rapidly revising a series of assumptions. Sasha was looking at the table. She had known the recording existed. She had known it and had written the letter and had come here anyway. And Claire thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to come to a room when you know the evidence in the room is against you. She thought it meant that you were coming not to win, but to be done, which was a different thing entirely, and which required, in its own way, a particular kind of nerve. The recording constitutes a documented admission of knowing misrepresentation, Gerald said, in the even tone he used when stating facts that required no additional commentary. It also constitutes evidence of an attempt, prior to the misrepresentation, to establish a paper record of duress. The question of what to do with this evidence is that depends significantly on what happens in the next portion of this conversation. Sasha's attorney began to say something. Could I speak to her? She was looking at Sasha, not at the attorney, because the attorney was not the relevant party in this room, and she had spent too much of her adult life addressing the intermediaries rather than the people behind them. Sasha looked up, finally, and met her eyes, and held them with the expression of someone who has stopped performing and is simply present. Outside, Claire said. The hallway, outside the conference room, had a bench against the wall beneath a window that looked into a light well, not a view in any scenic sense, but a rectangle of gray sky and the backs of neighboring buildings, which had its own kind of utility. Claire sat on one end of the bench. Sasha sat on the other. There was the distance of two people who do not know each other well and do not pretend otherwise. Claire spoke first, because she had asked for this, and it was hers to begin. I'm not going to use the recording, she said, not against you, specifically. What Gerald does with the broader case is not entirely mine to decide, and I won't lie to you about that. But you are not the thing I'm trying to address with this, and I don't intend to make you the story. You wrote me a letter, Claire said. You didn't have to do that. Why did you? Another pause. Longer, the pause of someone searching for the honest version of something they have been thinking about for a week, because I convinced myself, for a long time, that what I was doing was just business, that the personal part of it was separate from the professional part, and that I could keep them separate as long as I needed to, and that eventually it would resolve into something that made the whole picture coherent. And at some point in the middle of all of it, I looked at what I was actually doing, and I thought, if someone were doing this to me, if someone were using my situation to take something that was mine, I would want them to stop. She looked at her hands. Couldn't stop. But I could tell you. Claire looked at the light well, the gray rectangle of October sky, the backs of the indifferent buildings. I know something about convincing yourself that the personal and professional are separate when they aren't, she said. I spent 3 years doing it in a different direction. She looked at Sasha. I'm not saying that to draw an equivalence. I'm saying it because I understand how the mechanism works. And I understand that understanding the mechanism doesn't make you immune to it. And I'm not going to add to what you're already carrying by pretending I'm very far above it. Sasha's expression did something complicated, and then resolved into something simpler. What happens now? You leave the firm, Claire said. I think you've probably already worked that out. And you don't work with Daniel again in any capacity. And if anyone in this industry asks you directly about the situation, you tell the truth about your role in it. That is the version that protects you, legally, and it also happens to be accurate. Beyond that, I haven't decided what happens now. I don't have a position on your career, or your future, or your choices. Those are yours. Sasha looked at her for a moment. You're going to be very good at this, she said. It came out quietly, without competitive edge. It sounded like what it was. An observation made by someone who has just watched a person operate from a position of genuine strength and is recognizing it clearly for the first time. Get a better client, she said, and went back into the conference room. Daniel came on a Thursday. She had not given him her address directly, but the apartment was in her name, had always been in her name, and a man who had spent 3 years living alongside someone tends to know where to find the things they have not explicitly told him about. He knocked at 7 in the evening, which was deliberate, past the dinner hour, and before the time that late evening calls take on a different weight. She looked through the peephole first, the shape of his face on the other side of it, distorted by the lens into something slightly broader than he was, slightly more uncertain, was familiar, and also no longer familiar in the way it once had been. She opened the door. He was in a coat she recognized, dark wool, one of two he owned that she had helped him choose 4 years ago on a Saturday afternoon when they had been in the first year of their marriage. He was holding an envelope, personal stationery, the ivory kind he kept in his desk at the Greenwich House. "Can I come in?" She considered it for one full second. Then she stepped back. She did not offer him coffee. She led him to the sitting room, which was her grandmother's sitting room and contained her grandmother's furniture and her grandmother's books, and the specific accumulated atmosphere of a space that has been inhabited by someone very particular for a very long time. He looked at it briefly in the way of someone entering a space they had not expected to enter, and registering that it does not belong to the version of her they had been living alongside. Good, she thought. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat across from him, on the end of the sofa, with her legs parallel to the floor and her back straight and her hands in her lap. He held the envelope for a moment, turned it once, and then set it on the low table between them. "I wrote down what I want to say," he said, "because I knew if I didn't write it down, I would say the wrong version of it. And I've been saying wrong versions of things to you for years, and I didn't want to do that one more time." "What is the wrong version?" He looked at her. "The version where I try to explain, where I give you the context and the reasons and the pressures and the things I was managing, and it comes out sounding like justification. Because in my mind, there's a difference between explanation and justification, and I've never been able to hold that distinction reliably when I'm talking to you. Because somewhere in the 8 years of us, I stopped believing you would forgive me being fallible. So I started pretending I wasn't. And then the gap between the pretending and the reality got very large, and I stopped being able to see across it." Claire listened to this. She listened to it with the full attention she had learned to give things that were being said to her, without the familiar half-attention of someone who is composing their response while they listen. "That's honest," she said. "It's not enough," he said. It came out quickly, without the usual management. "I know it's not enough. I'm not here because I think it's enough. I'm here because you are having my child. And whatever has happened between us, I have not said to you. In a room, without the lawyers and the strategy and the specific version of myself I was performing. I have not said to you that I know what I did. I know what it cost. And I'm sorry." She held that. She let it have the space it was asking for, which was more than she would have given it 2 months ago, when the sorry would have arrived too early, and she would not have been far enough along in the business of becoming herself again to receive it with any clarity. She was far enough now. She could hear it clearly, which meant she could assess it clearly, which meant she could respond to it honestly. "I believe you're sorry," she said. "I want to be honest with you about what I believe, and I believe that. I also want to be honest about what sorry means to me right now, which is that it's information about where you are, and I'm glad to have it. And it doesn't change what I need." He looked at her. "What do you need?" he said, and it came out genuine, not as strategy, not as a position in a negotiation, but as the question of a man who does not know the answer and understands that he has forfeited the right to assume it. "I need you to understand that the marriage was not simply an affair," she said, "or two affairs, or a pattern of them. The affairs were the thing I could see. What was underneath them was something I couldn't see until I started looking. And what I found when I looked was that you had been. She chose the word carefully, systematically making me smaller, not with intent to destroy, but consistently, and in ways that served you, and in ways that you were aware enough of to understand what you were doing, even if you never examined why. She looked at him steadily. I let you do it. That's mine to own. I let it happen because I was afraid of what stopping it would cost. But you did it. And I need you to know that I know you did it. Not because I need you to feel guilty about it. I'm past needing that from you. But because if you are going to be in our son's life, you need to understand what you are capable of, and you need to be different from it. And you cannot be different from something you haven't named. The room was very still. Daniel looked at her for a long time. She could see the usual mechanism, the recalibration, the search for the appropriate response, the construction of the position. And then she could see, beneath it, something that was not a mechanism, something that was just a man sitting in a chair, being told something true, and knowing it was true, and having no system left with which to manage that knowledge. She had never seen that before. In 8 years, she had never seen him without the system. I know, he said, finally, not an elaboration, not a defense, not a reframe. 2 words, flat and unambiguous, which were the most weight she had ever heard him put in a sentence that short. She picked up the envelope from the table. She held it for a moment, feeling the heft of it. Several pages. Handwritten, probably. The kind of document a person writes when they have been composing something for weeks, and have finally decided to commit it to paper, rather than continuing to compose it in their head. She set it back down without opening it. I'll read it, she said. But I'll read it. The baby, she said. I will tell you when it's time. You will be present if you choose to be present. What happens after depends on choices that we're going to make over the next several months, one at a time. And I'm not going to decide the whole shape of them tonight. That's fair, he said. It's not about fair, she said, gently, because she was past needing it to be about fair and wanted him to understand that without it being a correction. It's about what's possible. I don't know the full shape of what's possible yet, and I'm not going to pretend I do. Neither should you. He picked up his coat. He looked around the sitting room one more time, at the books, at the photographs on the credenza that were her grandmother's, and her mother's, and her own, at the particular texture of a life that had been lived in this room for decades before he had any knowledge of it. And his expression had a quality she could not entirely name, but which had in it something that was close to understanding, the specific quality of a person who is seeing, for the first time, the full dimensions of what existed before them and what would exist after. At the door, he stopped. She's going to be lucky, he said. He looked at her once more. I'm going to try to deserve that. She said nothing, but she held the door for him, which was more than she had known she would do until she did it, and he thanked her for it without speaking. And then he was gone. 3 months later, January, the city in its most stripped-down version, the Christmas decorations gone, and the cold having achieved the particular quality of January cold that has stopped being seasonal and started being structural. Claire sat in the main conference room at Hale and Associates on the 14th floor of the limestone building on East 65th Street and signed her name to 7 documents. The conference room was not the room she had waited in the night of the gala. This was the working room, a mahogany table long enough for a board of 15, windows that faced north and admitted a white winter light that was clean and useful without being warm. She was 23 weeks pregnant, which was visible now, which was something she had crossed into the territory of comfort with over the past month. She had worn it to the first board meeting in November, and had watched the room's various attempts to process it with the equanimity of someone who has decided that her body's condition is information, and information belongs to everyone in the room. The documents were precise and comprehensive. Gerald had walked her through them 3 times over the past 2 weeks, and she had read each one independently and returned to him with questions. Not many, because he was thorough and she was paying attention. But specific questions about the governance structure and the mechanics of the board seat and two provisions in the operating agreement that she had wanted to understand at the level of intent rather than simply language. He had answered each question with the specific pleasure of a man who has been waiting a long time to answer them for someone who was ready to receive them. Marcus was across the table. He had been Marcus Hale for 40 years in this industry, which was to say he had been present at a great many tables for a great many transfers of a great many things. And he brought to this one the same quality he brought to all consequential moments: total presence, without ceremony. They signed in order. Gerald noted each signature, witnessed by the firm's paralegal. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound in the room between documents, and the sound was satisfying in the way that only physical acts of completion are satisfying, the way a key turning in a lock is satisfying, or a final stitch pulled through, or the last box sealed and labeled before a move. When the last document was signed, Gerald collected the copies into their respective folders, thanked the paralegal, and said he would give them a moment, and left the room with the discretion of a man who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. She looked at the signed documents in front of her. Then she looked out the window at the white January sky. Marcus, across the table, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw your father for the last time 3 months before he died." She looked at him. "He asked me to lunch," Marcus said, which James rarely did. "Your father was a breakfast man, as I'm sure you know. He preferred meetings before the day had accumulated its complications. Lunch was unusual. A pause, in which something moved through his expression that was not grief exactly, but was close to it. The expression of a man who does not have many people left from a particular time in his life and knows it. We sat at a table in a very quiet restaurant on Lexington Avenue that he had been going to since the 70s. And he ate his food, and we talked about a number of things. And then, at the end of the meal, he said something to me that I wrote down when I got back to my office, because I understood immediately that it was the kind of thing that needs to be preserved. She was very still, he said. "I am more proud of her than I have been of any professional accomplishment in my life, and I have not told her so sufficiently, and I'm going to run out of time before I get it right. So I am putting it somewhere she'll eventually find it." Marcus looked at her steadily. He meant the trust. He meant all of it. The clause, the design of it, the specific timing he built into it. He was building something to tell you the thing he kept not quite finding the language for. "I thought you should know the translation." The room received this. Claire received it. She had not cried since the funeral, not properly, not in the full sense. She did not know, until the moment it happened, that she was going to do it now, in a 14th floor conference room in January in the presence of Marcus Hale, who'd watched it happen with the expression of a man who is not going to make it smaller by trying to stop it. She cried for her father, who had eaten lunch on Lexington Avenue and composed a sentence and worried about running out of time, which he had, and had put the sentence somewhere she would eventually find it, which she had. She cried for the 3 years between his death and this room, which had been spent inside a contraction of herself that he had spent his last months trying to prevent, and which had happened anyway, briefly, before being reversed by his own careful foresight. She cried for the specific loneliness of having wanted, for 3 years, to tell him things and having nowhere to tell them, and for the specific comfort of understanding that he had known, in advance, the shape of what she would go through, and had loved her carefully enough to leave something solid for the other side of it. She pressed her hand flat on the table, the mahogany table, with the documents in front of her, bearing her signature, the table at which she was now a stakeholder and a board member, and her father's daughter in full, without reduction, and the baby kicked. Not a flutter, not the tentative small movement of the early weeks, a genuine, unambiguous kick, strong enough to feel fully through her palm against the fabric of her dress. A kick that had the specific quality of a person announcing themselves to a room that is paying attention. It came out through the tears and was both things at once, which was the only appropriate response to both things arriving at the same time. Marcus looked at her hand on the table, at her face, and his expression became something that was not entirely professional. Something that belonged to an older category than professional. The expression of a man who has spent 40 years watching serious things happen in serious rooms, and has just witnessed one of the serious things be interrupted by the future, which declines to wait for a convenient moment. "James," he said, very quietly, and it was clear that he was not addressing her. She understood what he meant. She pressed her hand more firmly against the table, against the wood that held the papers that held her name and her father's name, and the numbers that represented 30 years of what he had built. She looked at the window, the January sky, white and clear and enormous, she thought. "I have a great deal of work to do," she thought. "I am exactly the right person to do it," she thought. "Tell him I got here, and tell him it held." "Thank you," she said.
My wife couldn't handle tonight.
Who understood she was not speaking only to him, and who nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving
Please
a
welcome
message
Claire
they
Whitmore.
intend to honor. She picked up
You
her
chose
pen.
this room,
Outside,
Daniel.
the city went
I only
on.
arrived in it.
She went to work,